When a hard-working black mother's hot dog cart is destroyed by an aggressive officer, her life is turned upside down. But what starts as an act of injustice soon spirals into a chain of events no one could have foreseen. What happened next will leave you speechless. Where are you watching this from? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The sun had not yet risen when Lydia Grace's alarm clock buzzed with its familiar monotone hum. She rolled over in her small bed, silencing it with a practiced hand. Another day had begun, and there was no time to waste. The room around her was modest but clean, each piece of furniture worn but loved. Her nightstand held a faded photo of her late husband, William, whose smile was as steady as the man himself. She lingered on his image for a moment, drawing strength from the memory of his resilience. Life had been a constant battle since his passing, but she had never let herself falter for the sake of their children. In the kitchen, Lydia moved with deliberate efficiency. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as she prepared breakfast for her youngest son, Jaden. At 17, he was her anchor in a storm she fought daily. She set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the table just as he shuffled in, his hair disheveled from sleep. "Mornin', Mama," he mumbled, sitting down and immediately reaching for the food. His lanky frame was a constant reminder of how much he was growing, a bittersweet truth that filled her with both pride and trepidation. "Mornin', sweetheart. Eat up. I need your help loading the cart before school." Jaden nodded, his mouth full, and Lydia turned her attention to her own preparations. The supplies for her hot dog cart were neatly stored in plastic containers stacked by the door. Each day, she wheeled the cart to Lincoln Park, a place that had become both her sanctuary and her livelihood. The park was a hub of activity, drawing families, joggers, and office workers looking for a quick bite. Lydia's hot dogs had earned a reputation for being the best in town, a small comfort in a life otherwise riddled with challenges. By the time they reached the park, the city was beginning to stir. The early morning joggers were already out, their rhythmic footsteps echoing across the pavement. Lydia greeted them with a wave as she set up her cart near the fountain, a prime spot she had claimed years ago. Jaden helped unload the supplies, his movements quick and efficient. "You're getting good at this," Lydia said with a smile. "I've had a great teacher," he replied, grinning back. It was moments like these that reminded her why she worked so hard. Everything she did was for her children, to give them a better life, to keep them safe, to ensure they had opportunities she had only dreamed of. As the morning progressed, the park came alive with activity. Lydia greeted her regular customers with warmth, her voice carrying over the sounds of children laughing and dogs barking. There was Alex, the young entrepreneur who always ordered a coffee and a plain hot dog before heading to his office downtown. There was Stephen and Mary, the elderly couple who came every week to sit on the bench by the fountain and share a hot dog with extra mustard. Each interaction was a thread in the tapestry of her life, small but meaningful connections that kept her going. The other vendors in the park were part of this world, too. Miguel, who sold fresh fruit from a stall nearby, often helped Lydia carry her heavier supplies. He was a cheerful man with a booming laugh, always ready with a joke or a kind word. They looked out for each other, a quiet camaraderie born from shared struggles. Yet, beneath the surface of this bustling community lay an undercurrent of tension. The park was a microcosm of the city itself, a place where differences in race, class, and power were both visible and unspoken. Lydia had faced her share of challenges over the years. unjust fines, complaints from residents who didn't like her presence, and the ever-present threat of being displaced. She had learned to navigate these obstacles with grace, but they weighed on her nonetheless. One figure loomed larger than most in her thoughts: Officer Randall Miller. His reputation preceded him, whispered in cautious tones among the vendors. He was known for his aggressive enforcement of park regulations, often targeting those who couldn't fight back. Lydia had seen him only a few times, but each encounter left her uneasy. His eyes seemed to linger on her cart a moment too long, his presence a reminder of the fragility of her hard-earned stability. Today, though, Miller was nowhere to be seen, and Lydia allowed herself a moment of peace. She focused on her work, the rhythm of assembling hot dogs and chatting with customers lulling her into a sense of normalcy. Jaden had gone off to school, leaving her alone, but not lonely. The park was her domain, a place where she felt both grounded and free. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Lydia wiped her brow and leaned against her cart. Business was steady, and she allowed herself a moment to dream. Maybe, just maybe, she could save enough to pay off the last of her debts. Maybe she could help Jaden go to college without taking on more loans. Maybe the future wasn't as daunting as it seemed. But as the day wore on, a shadow fell across her thoughts. A memory surfaced, unbidden. The sound of Miller's voice, sharp and dismissive, as he questioned another vendor last week. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. There was no use worrying about what might happen. She had faced worse and come out stronger. When the sun began to set, Lydia started packing up her cart. The park was quieter now, the families and workers replaced by a few lingering joggers. Miguel waved goodbye as he closed his stall, and Lydia returned his wave with a tired smile. She wheeled her cart back toward the storage shed, her thoughts already turning to the next day. As she locked up for the night, Lydia allowed herself a moment to breathe. The day had been good, and for that she was grateful. Yet beneath her gratitude lay a simmering tension, an unspoken fear that the delicate balance she had achieved could be disrupted at any moment. She pushed the thought aside and began the walk home, the weight of her burdens momentarily lightened by the knowledge that she had made it through another day. Lydia didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She would face it with the same determination that had carried her this far. The park was her hope, her strength, and her future. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The morning began like so many others, with Lydia Grace moving through the motions of her carefully maintained routine. The alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., and she silenced it with a quick tap before swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Outside, the city was still cloaked in darkness, the streets silent save for the occasional distant hum of a passing car. In the kitchen, she prepared breakfast, the scent of scrambled eggs and toast filling the small space. Jaden appeared moments later, rubbing sleep from his eyes and offering his mother a sleepy smile. He was her youngest, her baby, though his growing frame and deepening voice made it increasingly clear that he was no longer a child. "Mornin', Mama," he murmured, dropping into a chair at the small table. "Mornin', sweetheart. Eat quickly, we need to leave soon," Lydia replied, setting his plate in front of him. As Jaden ate, Lydia gathered the supplies for her hot dog cart, double-checking that she had everything she needed: fresh buns, perfectly seasoned sausages, an assortment of condiments neatly packed into small containers. The routine was second nature now, each step a thread in the fabric of her daily life. By the time they reached Lincoln Park, the sun had begun its slow ascent, casting a pale golden glow over the city. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of dew, a reminder that autumn was approaching. Lydia wheeled her cart to its usual spot by the fountain, grateful for the quiet beauty of the early morning. Jaden helped her unload the supplies, his movements quick and efficient. Despite his growing responsibilities at school, he always found time to assist his mother. Lydia watched him with a mixture of pride and sadness. He was a good boy, hard-working, kind, and determined. She only wished she could give him more. "You're getting good at this," she said, smiling as he stacked the containers neatly. "Well, I've had plenty of practice," he replied with a grin, wiping his hands on his jeans. The park slowly came to life as the morning wore on. Joggers passed by, their rhythmic footsteps echoing across the pavement. Dog walkers strolled along the paths, their pets trotting happily at their sides. Families arrived, children's laughter ringing out as they played on the swings and climbed on the jungle gym. Lydia greeted her regular customers with warmth, her voice carrying over the ambient noise of the park. Alex, the young entrepreneur, stopped by for his usual order, a plain hot dog and a cup of coffee. He was always in a rush, his phone glued to his ear as he juggled the demands of his business. "Thanks, Lydia," he said, slipping her a few extra dollars as a tip before hurrying off. Stephen and Mary, the elderly couple who had been coming to the park for years, shared a hot dog with extra mustard as they sat on their favorite bench by the fountain. Lydia loved watching them. Their quiet companionship was a testament to a lifetime of shared moments. By noon, the park was bustling with activity. The line at Lydia's cart grew steadily, and she worked with practiced ease, assembling hot dogs and chatting with her customers. Jaden had left for school by then, leaving her to manage the cart on her own. She didn't mind. The work was familiar and comforting, a reminder of her resilience. But as the afternoon wore on, a subtle tension began to creep into the air. Lydia noticed a group of teenagers loitering near the playground, their laughter loud and slightly edged. She paid them little mind, focusing instead on her customers. Yet the unease lingered, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. Then she saw him, Officer Randall Miller. He was walking through the park, his broad shoulders squared and his expression impassive. Lydia's heart skipped a beat as she watched him approach. His presence was like a storm cloud on an otherwise sunny day, casting a shadow over the park. Miller stopped near a group of vendors, his sharp gaze sweeping over their stalls. Lydia saw Miguel, her friend who sold fresh fruit, stiffen slightly as the officer's eyes landed on him. Miller didn't say anything, but his presence was enough to unsettle the vendors. Lydia's pulse quickened as he turned in her direction. She tried to focus on her work, assembling a hot dog with careful precision. Miller stopped a few feet away from her cart, his expression unreadable. Lydia forced herself to smile, though her hands trembled slightly. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. Miller didn't respond immediately. He studied her cart, his eyes lingering on the neatly arranged condiments and the small sign that advertised her prices. Finally, he spoke, his tone flat and devoid of warmth. "Busy day?" Lydia nodded. "Yes, sir. It's always busy this time of year." Miller didn't reply. Instead, he lingered for a moment longer before turning and walking away. Lydia exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the edge of her cart. She watched him as he moved through the park, stopping occasionally to speak with other vendors. The unease in the air deepened, a weight that settled over the park like a heavy blanket. Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, a storm that had yet to break. But she pushed the thought aside, focusing on her work. There was no use worrying about what might happen. She had faced challenges before and come out stronger. As the sun began to set, Lydia started packing up her cart. The park was quieter now, the earlier bustle replaced by a calm stillness. She wheeled her cart back toward the storage shed, her thoughts heavy with a mix of gratitude and worry. Today had been a good day, but the shadow of Randall Miller's presence lingered in her mind. She couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Whatever it was, she knew she would face it with the same determination that had carried her this far. The park was her sanctuary, her hope, and she wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains in Lydia Grace's small kitchen as she sipped her coffee. Her eyes were tired, the dark circles beneath them a testament to another sleepless night. The unease from the previous day clung to her like a shadow, refusing to fade. She had done her best to shake it off, telling herself that nothing would come of Officer Miller's unwelcome visit to the park. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was about to go wrong. Jaden sat across from her, finishing his breakfast. He seemed to sense her mood, his usually bright demeanor subdued. "You okay, Mama?" he asked, his voice soft. Lydia managed a small smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a lot on my mind." Jaden nodded, though he didn't look convinced. He reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze before getting up to put his plate in the sink. "We'll get through whatever it is," he said, his tone firm. "We always do." His words brought a brief flicker of hope, but as Lydia loaded her cart and prepared to head to the park, the weight of her worry returned. The walk to Lincoln Park felt longer than usual, each step accompanied by a growing sense of foreboding. By the time she arrived and began setting up her cart near the fountain, her hands were trembling slightly. The park was already buzzing with activity. Joggers passed by, their rhythmic footsteps blending with the chatter of families and the occasional bark of a dog. Vendors called out to potential customers, their voices carrying over the din. It was a scene of normalcy, one Lydia had witnessed countless times, yet today it felt different, as if an invisible tension hung in the air. Miguel waved to her from his fruit stand, his broad smile a welcome sight. Lydia returned the wave, drawing comfort from the familiar routine. She focused on her work, unpacking her supplies and preparing for the day ahead. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her first customers arrived shortly after she opened, and for a while, Lydia allowed herself to be distracted by the steady rhythm of her work. She greeted each person with her usual warmth, her hands moving quickly as she assembled hot dogs and poured drinks. The hours passed, and the park grew busier, the crowd thickening as the day wore on. Then she saw him. Officer Randall Miller was walking through the park, his imposing figure cutting through the crowd like a knife. Lydia's heart sank as he approached, his expression cold and unreadable. She tried to steady her breathing, her hands gripping the edge of her cart as he stopped a few feet away. "Good afternoon," Miller said, his tone clipped. Lydia forced a smile. "Afternoon, officer. How can I help you?" Miller didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked over her cart, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something to criticize. Finally, he spoke. "You're set up in a restricted area," he said. "You'll need to move." Lydia blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "I've been here for years, officer. I have all the necessary permits." Miller's expression didn't change. "Rules change. This area is no longer authorized for vendors." Lydia felt her stomach drop. I haven't been notified of any changes, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I can show you my permits. I don't need to see your permits, Miller interrupted, his tone sharp. I'm telling you to move. The surrounding crowd had grown quiet, their attention drawn to the escalating tension. Lydia glanced around, seeing the concerned faces of her regular customers and fellow vendors. Miguel was watching from his stand, his expression a mix of worry and anger. "Officer, please," Lydia said, her voice steadying as she fought to keep her composure. "This cart is my livelihood. I can't just pack up and leave without a valid reason." Miller's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the air seemed to still. Then, without warning, he stepped forward and tipped over her cart. The sound of metal crashing against the pavement echoed through the park, followed by gasps from the crowd. Hot dogs, buns, and condiments spilled across the ground, a chaotic mess that mirrored the turmoil inside Lydia. "No!" Lydia cried, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the wreckage. "Why would you do this?" Miller ignored her, his expression indifferent as he stepped back. "You were warned," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Next time, follow the rules." Tears blurred Lydia's vision as she knelt beside her overturned cart, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the scattered items. The crowd stood frozen, too shocked to intervene. A few teenagers pulled out their phones, recording the scene, but no one stepped forward to help. "Mama!" Jaden's voice rang out as he appeared, having just arrived from school. He ran to her side, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. "What happened?" Lydia couldn't find the words. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched a broken bottle of mustard. Jaden turned to Miller, his fists clenched. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "This is her life. How could you?" Miller didn't respond. He simply adjusted his hat and walked away, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. The crowd parted to let him pass, their silence a testament to the weight of his authority. Jaden knelt beside his mother, wrapping his arms around her as she sobbed into his shoulder. Around them, the park seemed to hold its breath, the vibrant energy of the day replaced by a suffocating stillness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lydia sat on the ground, her hands still clutching the remnants of her cart. The world around her felt like a blur, the voices of those offering words of comfort drowned out by the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her dream, her sanctuary, had been shattered in an instant. And as she looked at the broken pieces of her livelihood, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever be able to rebuild. The walk home was a blur for Lydia, her mind a tangle of disbelief, anger, and despair. Jaden pushed what remained of the cart, his jaw clenched in silence. The normally vibrant streets of the city felt muted, as if they too mourned the destruction of her livelihood. When they finally reached their modest house, Lydia sank onto the worn couch, burying her face in her hands. Jaden set the broken cart aside and crouched in front of her, his eyes full of concern. "Mama," he said softly, "we'll figure something out." Lydia shook her head, her voice muffled. "How, Jaden? That cart was everything. Without it, I don't know how we'll get by." "You faced worse," he replied, gripping her hands firmly. "We faced worse, and we're still here." She looked up at him, tears streaking her cheeks. His determination was a glimmer of light in the darkness threatening to swallow her. Lydia pulled him into a hug, holding on to him as if he were the only thing keeping her grounded. After a while, Jaden sat beside her, pulling out his phone. "Mama, the whole thing was recorded. People need to see what happened." Lydia froze, her heart pounding. "What do you mean, recorded?" "Some of the kids at the park filmed everything," he explained, showing her the videos that had already started circulating on social media. The footage was clear. Officer Miller tipping over the cart, Lydia's frantic attempts to salvage her belongings, the stunned silence of the crowd. Her stomach twisted at the thought of strangers seeing her at her most vulnerable. But Jaden's voice cut through her hesitation. "This isn't just about us," he said. "People need to know what he did. How many others has he done this to? How many more will he do it to if no one speaks up?" Lydia took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the phone. She watched the video, her heart aching with each second. The humiliation, the injustice, it was all there for the world to see. "Do it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Post it." Jaden didn't hesitate. Within minutes, the video was live, accompanied by a caption that told their story in clear, heartfelt words. "Today, my mom's livelihood was destroyed by an officer abusing his power. This isn't just about us. It's about standing up to injustice. Share if you believe this is wrong." The response was immediate. Within hours, the video had thousands of views, the comments flooding in faster than Lydia could read them. Many expressed outrage and support, while others shared their own stories of unfair treatment. Yet, not all the responses were positive. There were those who defended the officer, accusing Lydia of playing the victim or questioning the legitimacy of her business. The conflicting reactions overwhelmed her, and she turned to Jaden. "I don't know if I can handle this," she admitted. "You don't have to face it alone," he assured her. "We've got people on our side." That night, Lydia struggled to sleep. Memories of the day played on a loop in her mind, mingling with fears about the future. How would she provide for her family now? What if the backlash from the video made things worse? Despite Jaden's confidence, doubt gnawed at her resolve. The next morning, a knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Miguel standing there, a bag of fresh fruit in his hands. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Lydia. That man had no right." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, and she invited him inside. Miguel sat at the small kitchen table, his large hands folded in front of him. "I was thinking," he began, "maybe we can set up a fundraiser. The people in this neighborhood love you, Lydia. They'll want to help." Lydia hesitated. Accepting charity felt like admitting defeat, but Miguel's earnest expression softened her resistance. "I don't know," she said. "I've never been good at asking for help." "You wouldn't be asking," Miguel replied. "We'd be offering. Let us do this for you." Jaden, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "Mama, he's right. You've given so much to this community. Let them give back." Lydia looked between the two of them, their determination mirrored in their eyes. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, "but only if we can find a way to pay it forward once we're back on our feet." Miguel grinned, his relief palpable. "Deal." Within hours, the fundraiser was live, accompanied by the viral video and a heartfelt message from Miguel about Lydia's dedication to her family and the community. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, and messages of support flooded her inbox. People she hadn't seen in years reached out, offering words of encouragement and sharing fond memories of her hot dog cart. Despite the outpouring of kindness, Lydia couldn't shake her anxiety. The video had drawn attention, but it also painted a target on her back. She received anonymous messages, some filled with hateful words, others more sinister in their threats. Jaden urged her to ignore them, but the fear lingered, a constant presence in the back of her mind. One evening, as she was closing the curtains, she noticed a car idling across the street. The headlights were off, but the faint glow of a cigarette was visible through the driver's side window. Lydia's chest tightened as she stepped away from the window, her hands shaking. "Mama, what's wrong?" Jaden asked, appearing at her side. "Nothing," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But Jaden wasn't fooled. He put an arm around her shoulders, his presence a small comfort. "We'll get through this," he said again, his voice unwavering. Lydia nodded, though her fear refused to dissipate. She knew they were in for a long battle, one that would test their strength in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But for now she clung to the small victories, the fundraiser, the support of her neighbors, and the unwavering love of her son. As the days passed, Lydia began to find her footing again. The pain of losing her cart was still fresh, but it was no longer all-consuming. She started to believe in the possibility of rebuilding, of creating something even stronger than before. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was no stranger to hardship. And if there was one thing Lydia Grace knew how to do, it was survive. By the third morning after the fundraiser began, Lydia woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the bedside table. Groggy, she reached for it and squinted at the screen. The notifications were endless: messages, comments, and calls. The fundraiser had gone viral, far beyond anything she had expected. Her modest goal to rebuild the cart had been surpassed within a day, and now the donations were continuing to climb. Jaden burst into her room, phone in hand, his face alight with excitement. "Mama, you won't believe this. Look at these numbers." He held up his phone, displaying the fundraiser total, which had doubled overnight. Lydia sat up slowly, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. I don't understand. Why are so many people helping?" "Because they care," Jaden said simply. "Your story struck a nerve. People are tired of this kind of injustice." Miguel called shortly after, his voice brimming with pride. "Lydia, the whole city's talking about you. Local news wants an interview. They say your story is inspiring." The thought of being on camera made Lydia's stomach churn, but Miguel reassured her. "You don't have to do it alone. Just tell your story the way you always do, with honesty." Later that day, Lydia found herself sitting at the kitchen table, preparing for a video interview. Jaden adjusted the angle of her phone, ensuring the light was just right. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her shirt. "You'll do great," Jaden said. "Just be yourself." The interviewer appeared on the screen, a warm smile immediately putting Lydia somewhat at ease. "Lydia, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Your story has touched so many people. How are you feeling?" Lydia took a deep breath. "It's been overwhelming," she admitted. "I'm grateful for the support, but it's been a lot to process. I never expected this to happen." As the interview continued, Lydia spoke about her late husband, the struggle to keep her family afloat, and the community she had built through her cart. She described the incident with Officer Miller, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. When the interview ended, Jaden hugged her tightly. "You were amazing, Mama." That evening, the news clip aired, and Lydia's story spread even further. Messages poured in from around the country, people offering support, sharing their own experiences, and calling for action against Officer Miller. Lydia was both heartened and overwhelmed. The spotlight was growing brighter, and with it came an unsettling sense of vulnerability. The backlash began subtly, with a few comments questioning her story's validity. But as the days passed, the tone grew darker. Anonymous messages accused her of lying, of seeking attention, of profiting from pity. One night, as she checked her phone before bed, she froze at a message that read, "You should have stayed quiet. You'll regret this." Lydia showed Jaden the message, her voice shaking. What if this was a mistake? What if speaking out only makes things worse? Jaden took her hand, his eyes filled with quiet determination. They're trying to scare you because they know you're right. Don't let them win, Mama. We're stronger than this. The next day, as Lydia tried to regain her focus, there was another knock at the door. This time it wasn't Miguel. A tall, well-dressed man introduced himself as David Harper, a civil rights attorney who had seen her story on the news. "Mrs. Grace, I'm deeply sorry for what happened to you," he said. "I'd like to help you hold Officer Miller accountable. This isn't just about your cart. It's about the abuse of power and the harm it causes." Lydia hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough for this," she admitted. "It's already been so much." David nodded, his voice gentle. "I understand. But if we don't stand up to this now, it will keep happening. To you, to others. You've already started something powerful. Let's see it through." Jaden stepped forward, his expression resolute. "We're in," he said before Lydia could respond. She looked at her son, seeing in him the same courage and strength she had tried to instill. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, let's do it." The following week was a whirlwind of meetings, statements, and preparation. David explained that the case wouldn't be easy. Officer Miller was well connected, and his record, while questionable, didn't yet contain anything that would clearly incriminate him. "We'll need to prove a pattern of abuse," David said. "That means finding others who've had similar experiences." Lydia's stomach churned at the thought of reliving her trauma over and over, but she agreed to move forward. To her surprise, others began coming forward, inspired by her bravery. Vendors from the park shared their stories of harassment and intimidation. A young man recounted an incident where Miller had unjustly fined him for sitting on a park bench after hours. Slowly, the pieces of a larger picture began to emerge. As the legal case took shape, the community rallied around Lydia. A group of local activists organized a peaceful demonstration in the park, demanding accountability from the police department. Lydia attended, though the idea of standing in front of a crowd made her nervous. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone, her heart pounding. "I'm just a mother trying to make an honest living," she began, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to be here, speaking out against something so painful, but I've learned that silence only allows injustice to grow. We have to stand together, not just for me, but for everyone who's been hurt by abuse of power." The crowd erupted in applause, their support lifting her spirits. For the first time in weeks, Lydia felt the glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the change her story could inspire. That night, as she sat at the kitchen table with Jaden, she allowed herself a small smile. The storm was far from over, but she no longer felt alone in facing it. The fight ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, she believed it was one worth fighting. Together, they were building something stronger than her cart had ever been, a foundation of resilience, community, and justice. The courthouse loomed ahead, an imposing structure of gray stone that seemed to swallow the morning light. Lydia stood on the steps, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. Jaden was by her side, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her as they prepared to step into the most daunting chapter of their journey yet. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. Reporters jotted notes, cameras flashed outside, and the seats behind the defense table were filled with a mixture of supporters, skeptics, and those who simply sought to witness the spectacle. Officer Randall Miller sat at the defendant's table, his expression calm, almost bored, as if the entire proceeding were a minor inconvenience. Lydia's stomach churned as her attorney, David Harper, leaned close to her. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "Stay composed, tell your truth, and remember, you've got people behind you." The first day of the trial was grueling. David began by laying out Lydia's case with clarity and precision, painting a picture of systemic abuse that went beyond her singular experience. He presented evidence, including the now viral video of Miller overturning Lydia's cart, and introduced witnesses who would testify to similar encounters with the officer. Miller's defense team, however, was formidable. They dismissed the video as an isolated incident, argued that the officer had been following protocol, and attempted to discredit Lydia by implying that her business had violated park regulations. Lydia's first time on the stand was a test of endurance. She recounted the events of that day, her voice steady despite the emotion simmering beneath the surface. The defense attorney's cross-examination was sharp and invasive, attempting to poke holes in her story. "Mrs. Grace," the attorney began, his tone dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that you have received fines for your cart in the past?" "Yes," Lydia admitted, "but I paid them and corrected any issues. None of them were about my location. I've had the same spot for years." "And yet you claim you didn't know your spot was unauthorized? Isn't it possible Officer Miller was simply enforcing the rules?" Lydia's jaw tightened. "No, because I followed all the rules. He didn't ask to see my permits. He didn't try to discuss anything with me. He just destroyed my cart." The defense attorney smirked, but Lydia refused to look away. She could feel Jaden's gaze on her from the gallery, his silent encouragement giving her the strength to hold firm. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster. Witnesses came forward, recounting their own encounters with Miller. A vendor testified about being fined excessively for minor infractions. A young man shared a chilling story of being detained by Miller without cause, his voice shaking as he spoke of the humiliation he felt. Piece by piece, David began to construct a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Miller's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a troubling pattern. Yet, the defense continued to fight back with equal ferocity. They questioned the credibility of witnesses, highlighted the lack of prior formal complaints against Miller, and argued that he was being unfairly vilified for doing his job. As the trial progressed, Lydia began to doubt herself. Each time the defense seemed to gain ground, she felt the weight of the fight pressing down on her. But every time she considered giving up, Jaden reminded her of why she had started this journey. One day, during a particularly grueling session, a surprise witness came forward. It was an elderly woman named Clara, who had once been a regular vendor at the park. She walked slowly to the stand, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "Officer Miller harassed me for months," she began. "He said my stall was an eyesore, that I was driving away respectable customers. One day, he fined me so heavily I couldn't afford to keep my business open. I had no choice but to leave." Her testimony was a turning point. Clara's story was the final piece of the puzzle, confirming what Lydia and others had suspected. Miller's actions weren't just about enforcing rules, they were targeted, personal, and deeply unjust. The courtroom was silent as Clara finished. Lydia felt tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them back, a sense of vindication washing over her. In the closing arguments, David spoke with quiet conviction. This case is about more than a cart, more than a single day in the park. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that power is not wielded as a weapon, but used to protect and serve everyone equally. Mrs. Grace isn't just fighting for herself, she's fighting for all of us. The defense, in contrast, focused on painting Miller as a dedicated officer caught in the crossfire of a larger social issue. This is not a trial about systemic problems, the attorney argued. It's about one moment, one decision, and an officer who believed he was doing his job. When the trial ended, the weight of the jury's deliberation hung heavy in the air. Lydia sat outside the courtroom with Jaden, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mama," Jaden said, his voice soft, "no matter what happens, I'm proud of you." She managed a small smile, squeezing his hand. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." After hours of waiting, the jury returned with their verdict. Miller was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority, though the punishment, a suspension without pay and mandatory retraining, felt like a slap on the wrist to Lydia. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions about her thoughts on the verdict. Lydia paused, her mind racing. Finally, she said, "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Today is just one step in a much longer fight." That evening, Lydia sat at the kitchen table with Jaden, the house quiet around them. The trial was over, but the journey felt far from complete. "We did what we could," Jaden said, his voice filled with a mix of pride and exhaustion. "And look how many people stood with us." Lydia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. The fight had been worth it, not because of the outcome, but because of what it represented: resilience, courage, and the power of community. She had lost her cart, but she had gained something far greater: a voice, a platform, and the knowledge that she was never truly alone. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting warm rays on the neatly set table where Lydia, Grace, and Jaden sat. It had been a week since the trial ended, and though the legal battle was behind them, the aftermath lingered in subtle ways. Lydia still caught herself glancing over her shoulder when walking through the park, or hesitating before answering calls from unknown numbers. Yet, amidst the lingering tension, there was also a quiet sense of triumph, a belief that they had set something in motion, something bigger than themselves. The fundraiser had far exceeded their expectations, and the community had rallied to support her in ways she had never imagined. Miguel had taken charge of organizing a reopening event, insisting that Lydia's return to the park should be celebrated. "You're a symbol now," he had said, his booming voice filled with pride. "People need to see you come back stronger." Lydia wasn't sure she believed she was a symbol of anything, but she agreed nonetheless. The thought of reopening her business, of reclaiming her space in the park, filled her with equal parts excitement and apprehension. On the day of the event, the park was alive with activity. Balloons were tied to the lamp posts, and a small stage had been set up near the fountain. The smell of freshly grilled hot dogs wafted through the air, mingling with the crisp scent of fall. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of familiar and new. Children ran between the legs of adults, laughter echoing across the park. Lydia stood behind her brand-new cart, its stainless steel surface gleaming in the sunlight. It was more than she had ever dreamed of, a gift from a local entrepreneur who had been moved by her story. It's not just a cart, he had told her. It's a symbol of resilience. Jaden was beside her, his energy infectious as he helped set up. "Mama," he said, grinning, "I think you're about to be famous." She laughed, the sound light and unguarded. It felt good to laugh, to let go of the weight she had carried for so long. As the event began, Miguel took to the stage, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to celebrate not just the reopening of Lydia's business, but the spirit of our community. This park is a place for everyone, and Lydia has always been a part of what makes it special. Her strength, her determination, and her kindness have inspired us all." The crowd erupted in applause, and Lydia felt her cheeks flush as she stepped forward to say a few words. She clutched the microphone, her hands trembling slightly, but as she looked out at the sea of supportive faces, her nerves began to fade. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you for standing by me, for believing in me, and for reminding me that no matter how hard life gets, we're never truly alone. This cart, it's not just a way for me to provide for my family. It's a reminder that together we can overcome anything." The applause was deafening, and Lydia felt tears prick at her eyes. She glanced at Jaden, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she continued, "This isn't the end of our fight. There's still work to be done to make sure no one else has to go through what we did. But today, let's celebrate what we've accomplished. Let's celebrate community, resilience, and hope." The crowd roared its approval, and Lydia stepped back, her heart full. She returned to her cart, where a long line of customers had already formed. With Jaden's help, she began serving hot dogs, her hands moving with the same practiced efficiency as always. Each order was a reminder of why she had fought so hard to reclaim her place in the park. As the day wore on, Lydia found herself surrounded by warmth and laughter. Old friends stopped by to offer their congratulations, while new faces introduced themselves, eager to support her business. Miguel hovered nearby, making sure everything ran smoothly, his wide grin never faltering. At one point, a little girl approached the cart with her father. She stared up at Lydia with wide eyes before shyly handing her a crayon drawing. It depicted Lydia standing behind her cart, surrounded by smiling people. "This is you," the girl said softly. "You're a hero." Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she accepted the drawing. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is the best gift I've ever received." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Lydia looked around at the bustling park. The fountain sparkled in the fading light, and the laughter of children filled the air. For the first time in months, she felt at peace. Jaden nudged her, his eyes shining with pride. "See, Mama? I told you we'd make it." She smiled, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "We did, didn't we?" The reopening event wound down as the evening grew darker, but Lydia stayed behind, cleaning up with Jaden and Miguel. When the park was finally quiet, she sat on the edge of the fountain, gazing at her cart. It wasn't just a cart anymore. It was a testament to everything she had overcome, a symbol of the strength she had found within herself and the support she had received from those around her. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Lydia made a silent promise to herself. She would continue to fight, not just for her family, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated. Her journey was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready for whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, She allowed herself to bask in the joy of her hard-won victory. The park was hers again, not just a place to work, but a place to dream, to hope, and to build a future worth fighting for. The weeks following the reopening of Lydia's cart were a whirlwind of change. The park was no longer just a place of business. It had become a beacon of hope and resilience, a symbol of what could be achieved when a community stood together. But for Lydia, the deeper transformation was internal. She no longer felt like a victim of her circumstances. She had found her voice, her strength, and a renewed purpose. One crisp morning, Lydia stood at her cart, her hands moving with the familiar rhythm of assembling hot dogs. The line was long, filled with regulars and new customers alike. Jaden worked beside her, laughing with a group of kids as he handed out napkins. The air was alive with the sounds of the park, children playing, dogs barking, and the distant hum of city life. As the crowd thinned, a woman approached the cart. She was tall and composed, her sharp suit contrasting with the casual attire of the park-goers. She introduced herself as Camille Harper, a journalist who had been following Lydia's story. "I wanted to meet you in person," Camille said, her tone warm but professional. "Your story has touched a lot of people, but I think there's more to it than what's been reported." Lydia wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. "I'm not sure what else there is to say. I'm just trying to rebuild my life." Camille smiled. "That's exactly what makes it so powerful. You didn't just rebuild. You became a symbol for something bigger. I'd like to write a deeper feature, something that highlights the larger issues your story represents." Lydia hesitated, her mind flashing back to the stress of the trial and the public scrutiny that had followed. But then she thought of Jaden, of Miguel, of Clara, and the others who had stood beside her. She thought of the young girl who had called her a hero, and the countless messages she had received from people inspired by her courage. "All right," she said finally. "If my story can help others, I'll do it." The interview took place a few days later at the park. Camille asked thoughtful questions, drawing out details Lydia hadn't shared before. Her struggles after her husband's death, the quiet moments of doubt she faced, and the strength she found in her community. By the end of the conversation, Lydia felt lighter, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. The article was published in a major newspaper, its headline simple but powerful: "The Woman Who Took Back the Park." It highlighted not only Lydia's journey but also the systemic issues that had allowed Officer Miller's behavior to go unchecked for so long. The piece sparked discussions across the city, leading to calls for greater accountability within the police department and more support for small business owners. One afternoon, as Lydia prepared to close her cart for the day, a group of young people approached her. They introduced themselves as members of a local advocacy group working to address inequality and systemic injustice. "Your story inspired us," one of them said. "We want to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. Would you consider speaking at one of our events?" Lydia blinked, caught off guard. She had never thought of herself as a public speaker, but as she looked into their eager faces, she felt a spark of determination. "I'll think about it," she said, her lips curving into a small smile. That evening, she sat with Jaden at the kitchen table, the house quiet around them. She told him about the group's invitation, and he immediately broke into a grin. "You should do it, Mama. You've got a lot to say, and people need to hear it." "Maybe," Lydia said, her voice thoughtful. "But I don't want this to just be about me. I want it to be about all of us." Jaden nodded, his expression serious. "Then make it about all of us." Tell them about Miguel, Clara, and everyone who helped. Show them what a community can do. The next week, Lydia stood on a small stage in a packed community center, her heart pounding as she faced the crowd. She gripped the microphone tightly, her eyes scanning the room. Familiar faces smiled back at her. Miguel, Clara, Jaden, and a wave of calm washed over her. "I'm not a politician or a lawyer," she began, her voice steady. "I'm just a mother who wanted to take care of her family. But along the way, I learned something important. We're stronger together. When we stand up for each other, when we refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice, we create the kind of world we want to live in." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Lydia felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her fight had started as a personal battle, but it had become something much greater, a movement fueled by hope, resilience, and the belief that change was possible. As she stepped off the stage, Jaden hugged her tightly. "You were amazing, Mama," he said, his voice filled with pride. Lydia smiled, her heart full. The park was still her sanctuary, but now it was also a starting point, a place where dreams could grow and a brighter future could take root. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she was ready for them. Together, with her community by her side, she knew they could face anything. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video with your friends and family. Maybe it will inspire someone just like you. And to learn even more interesting stories, go to the next video or explore others on our channel. See you soon.